First of all, just thanks to Rachel and the team for putting this opportunity together to discuss migration. I'm just going to present a little bit of my PhD research, which is actually a little bit connected to what Sarah is going to share about. So I'm looking at human trafficking among refugees and asylum seekers. My PhD overall looks at the role of international law in preventing and tackling human trafficking among refugees and asylum seekers. I look at three main areas, so anti-trafficking law, human rights law, and refugee asylum law. But today, just going to focus a little bit on international anti-trafficking law, and it'll be quite a broad overview just given time. Hopefully we can have a little bit of a discussion. And before I look at the legal frameworks, I want to talk a little bit about what the problem is. Like, what do we mean when we say trafficking among refugees, asylum seekers? Then a little bit about international and regional European frameworks. And then I want to draw your attention to maybe a contradiction or a conflict, which I think needs to be discussed more in the discourse. And so that's what we're going to do. So very briefly, just to set out, just so we're all on the same page, what is human trafficking? Well, there are a number of conceptual discussions which do continue as to the limits and boundaries of the trafficking definition. But generally speaking, the internationally accepted legal definition is contained in Article 3 of the Palermo Protocol, which is a protocol to the Convention on Transnational Organised Crime. So it's a transnational organised crime context that it's set in. And there's three elements that need to be fulfilled in a set of factual circumstances for an act to constitute human trafficking. So you can see them here on the screen: an act, a means, and a purpose. And I think something to point out is that the purpose is a mental element, so that means that the exploitation doesn't have to occur for an act to constitute trafficking. It is actually sufficient that the exploitation is really important in broadening the range of trafficking. So when we think of the asylum context, and what do I mean when I say trafficking in the asylum context? What I've got here on the screen is a very simplistic outline of the asylum process. So obviously, not every asylum seeker's journey just goes straight from stage to stage, but I think this shows the various stages of the process. And if you see the first red line of kind of the journey into the country of asylum, I think a lot of people tend to think of trafficking in that context of just across the border. And of course that is where trafficking can occur, but it can occur all throughout the process, and even where protection has been granted. So I've put protection. So protection can be granted in law, but actually the literature that I reviewed demonstrates that the risk and the reality of trafficking persists through the whole process. And if that's the case, then I think we need to look at whether the legal frameworks to tackle trafficking among refugees and asylum seekers actually are capable of functioning throughout the process and not just on one stage or another. So that's what we're talking about when we are talking about trafficking among refugees and asylum seekers. So moving on then, what are the international and European frameworks? So in my research, I also look at the African region as well, but just today in the focus of the European studies, I'm focusing on the global and the European. So at the global level, as I've said, there's the Palermo Protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking of persons. And that is the protocol to the UN Convention on Transnational Organised Crime. So that's the main international instrument that tackles human trafficking. At the European level, there's two different streams. You've got the Council of Europe Convention Against Trafficking. So obviously the most famous Council of Europe Convention is most probably the European Convention on Human Rights, but they have other conventions, and ECAP is a very important one. And there's a recent case at the UK Supreme Court, MS Pakistan, where ECAP did play a role. So definitely does have a role to play. And we'll get to that in a little minute as well. And then in the EU, the competence to act in trafficking is in Articles 79, 82 and 83 of the TFEU. And then there's a couple of key directives. 2011-36, probably the most important and extensive one. And then 2004-81 on residence permit for victims. So that's the kind of main framework we're talking about. So I do argue that it's important to consider these frameworks in the asylum context as a sort of source of protection. And if we look then very briefly, of course today we don't have time to go into detail in each framework, but if we have a little bit of a look at the overview of these frameworks and what they can contribute to the asylum context. Obviously, I've mentioned it's a transnational organised crime context that Palermo was in. None of these instruments have a specific focus on refugees and asylum seekers, but there are definitely provisions that can be of use in the asylum context. So we see, obviously, it's defined in trafficking is defined in Article 3 of the Palermo Protocol, and actually we see that definition duplicated across ECAT and the EU directives. So in that, we can see the role of the Palermo Protocol, the kind of normative force of that protocol, that the definition is replicated regionally and nationally. So it's being sort of very strong force of that definition, and the obligation to criminalise that definition is, I would argue, a strength there, that actually conduct amounting to trafficking, there's an international obligation to criminalise that. I think that's very useful in the asylum context, but I think since the definition's force is so strong from Palermo, I think it's important to look at whether that definition is fit for purpose in the asylum context, which I do a bit in my research, and I would say it definitely has its strengths. Protection and prevention obligations then in all three. Some have criticised them in Palermo for being weak. That is because some of the obligations require states to consider adopting certain measures rather than requiring them to adopt certain measures. But at the same time, they're there, they exist, and I think there's definitely potential for them to function quite well in the asylum context. One I just want to draw attention to is Article 10 of ECAT, which actually requires states to take steps to identify victims of trafficking where it has occurred. And it's actually on the basis of this article that a lot of states have developed referral mechanisms, which I'm sure a number of you will be familiar with, and other regimes to see the victims are identified. So the potential of articles such as this to work and function in the asylum context are quite promising, but I think it depends on how it's received and how trafficking in the asylum context is understood at the domestic level. So, for example, we know that the risk and reality of trafficking continues through the process. So it's important that Article 10 isn't implemented by only having detection and referral mechanisms at the border or in the first screening process, but actually through the process. So the potential of these articles really depends on how they're implemented in domestic law, policy and practice. So we can see that these instruments definitely do have a lot of potential to be of use in the asylum context. And I think it's important that we continue to make those connections between trafficking and the asylum context so that these instruments continue to be sort of teased out in that context. And there definitely is a lot of positive things that can happen. But one thing I want to draw attention to is a potential problematic area, and that is the border measures provisions. You see, I put that there, it's in Article 11 in Palermo and 7 in ECAT, but I'll focus on the Palermo definition, although it's quite similar in ECAT. So the question that I want to ask is, are there obligations in the protocol and regional instruments which in the asylum context could be said to actually have the potential to increase the risk and reality of trafficking? So in other words, when applied to the circumstances of trafficking among refugees and asylum seekers, are there any aspects of anti-trafficking law which actually have the potential to increase the risk and or reality of the very thing it aims to combat? And if that's the case, then I think we really do need to continue a discussion about what to do about that. So Article 11, the border measures, what am I talking about? Well, it requires states to strengthen, to the extent possible, such border controls as may be necessary to prevent and detect trafficking in persons. And so, while in principle this article might be helpful because it could result in measures being put in place to detect potential or actual trafficking victims, it's also potentially problematic, and I think this is especially visible in the asylum context. So this clause has been criticised by other academics as actually hindering access to asylum in practice. And I think that's even more concerning when we look at the evidence which shows the link between trafficking and long and difficult asylum journeys that include smuggling. And so the question I want to ask is, more than just hindering or deterring asylum seekers, could we have situations where actually fulfilling obligations under Article 11 or taking measures at the domestic level and relying on Article 11 as a justification are actually resulting in a greater risk of trafficking among quite a significant population, that is refugees and asylum seekers? And I think this concern has been raised by others. So Chatil, for example, has raised the concern, and a former UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking has acknowledged the existence of a strong causal link between restrictive immigration policies and trafficking. And if that is the case, then while there may be some potential or actual benefits of Article 11, I think we need to ask some serious questions about its compatibility with the overall objective purpose of the protocol and how exactly we should interpret Article 11 given what we know. So one possible solution, perhaps, there's a savings clause in the protocol which says that nothing in the protocol shall affect the rights and obligations under other things like the Refugee Convention. So this clause, it has been noted, does establish some sort of hierarchy where the Refugee Convention will always trump the protocol in cases of conflicts. That's great, but what about these less explicit conflicts, such as Article 11 conflicting with the overall spirit of refugee law? What about something even more complex, like Article 11 conflicting with the overall object and purpose of the trafficking protocol that it's contained in itself? What do we do there? International law requires the treaty obligations, such as Article 11, to be interpreted in line with its ordinary meaning and in the light of its object and purpose of the treaty. But is it actually possible to interpret Article 11 in this way, given what we know when we look at the asylum context? I think perhaps it might be, but it would definitely need to be interpreted very restrictively and in a way that states don't be able to rely on this to just completely shut down all forms of migration. And I think it's something, even if it is going to be interpreted restrictively, you might still argue that it's impossible to completely reconcile the rationale and the results of Article 11 with the overall spirit of the protocol. And I think this is a question that remains underexplored. And I think there aren't really any straightforward answers, and it's something I think the discussion on this really needs to continue. In particular, the question of whether there are articles in the protocol that actually conflict with the object and purpose of the protocol itself when we look at the asylum context. So that's something that I'm continuing to look at in my research. I don't think there's any straightforward answers for now. And so just to sum up, really what I've tried to display today is that the risk and reality of trafficking is observable at all stages of the asylum process. So not just when we're crossing the border, but actually at all the stages. And so the response needs to take account of that and function in that way. International and regional anti-trafficking law is one potential tool, even in the overall international legal framework. And of course, there's a variety of non-legal responses that have to work together too. So I'm not trying to say it's the only thing that can do something, but it is something. And so if it is a tool, I think we should try and understand its strengths and weaknesses so that we can more effectively use it. So I've highlighted some of the strengths today, and I've obviously drawn attention to one problematic area, the border measures provisions, which are to be explored further. So I'll sum up here, and I'm happy to take any questions after. And thank you very much for your time. No, I just stopped sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Gillian. That was brilliant. Really interesting. And I definitely have a couple of questions, but we'll come on to them next. Sarah, how are you getting on with your screen?
This is the title of my research project. It's possible that it's going to change later, but I'm just going to jump right into it. And if I start talking really fast, please let me know. My research project is part of, if you go to the next slide, please, it's called project. No, just before this one. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Which is looking at the impact of flight experiences on the psychological well-being of unaccompanied refugee minors. Next slide, please. And the project is longitudinal. We're doing a follow-up of a large group of unaccompanied refugee minors in different countries. I'll tell you what the countries are in a minute. We are using a mixed methods approach. We're just looking at what happened to them along the way between when they left home, what happened in transit, and then where they end up going to. The role of smuggling networks in the process. And so our countries of research are Libya, Greece, Italy, and Belgium. We're looking at Libya, transit country, Greece and Italy as countries of arrival, and transit and settlement as well. They're kind of in between. And then Belgium as a country of settlement. And so my project, I'm one of the researchers, one of two researchers who's doing research on the Italy context of research. And I'm looking specifically at Nigerian women who went into Italy for sexual exploitation. So looking at what are the experiences that they have along the way, smuggled versus trafficked, both and. How do they cope with their experiences and exploitation, and then potentially the role and the influence in their migration journey. How the Palermo Protocol, so that's fantastic. I'm just going to jump past that. Issues that's come up quite a bit in the research is the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling, and I really wanted to have this very simplistic definition up to make sort of a difference between the two, of how like human trafficking is a crime against the person, but human smuggling is a crime against the state. And I know for me, working in practice, it's been an issue that came up a lot with law enforcement officers saying, are you talking to us about a trafficking case or a smuggling case or both? Because they have different legislations depending on the country. And then I'm just people will just have a big overview of what it looks like. So then I'm going to go straight into my participants overview. They are Nigerian females who arrived in Italy between June 2016 and June of 2018 via the Central Mediterranean. So these are all women and girls who came into Italy by boat from Libya into Italy. I have 21 adults and 10 unaccompanied refugee minors. Nigerians still constitute one of the largest number of migrants arriving in Europe through the Central Mediterranean, and 80% of the women are estimated to be victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation. Emma, you can have the text. Yeah, and one more. Thank you. And in 2016, 11,000 women arrived in Italy from Nigeria via Libya. These are the number of women that were actually registered. We know that the numbers are probably higher, but these are those that were registered for arrival in Italy. So looking at the Nigerian context, an estimated 30,000 Nigerian women have been trafficked from Nigeria to Italy within the last 3 decades. Again, these figures are very, very moderate. The belief is that there are actually a lot more. Nigeria is the source, transit, and destination country when it comes to human trafficking, meaning that they get women from Nigeria, they bring them through Nigeria, and they traffic within Nigeria. And the average age of trafficked children is actually 15. So when we're talking about Nigerians who are trafficked into Europe, we're talking about people who may have been brought in when they were 15 or 16, and now they're 18. And even if you think about the refugee laws and the laws for unaccompanied refugee minors, what happens when a girl is trafficked when she's 16, and then she works on the streets, and then finally when she's 18, she applies for asylum, but she's already an adult. And so these are all the issues, like the different layers of the trafficking phenomena. In 2017, 15% of all registered CRI were from Nigeria. 88 were accompanied children, 1,228 were unaccompanied minors. So again, in context, what makes it what makes it significantly different from other cases of trafficking is the fact that when we're talking about human trafficking of Nigerians, there's always the voodoo element. Well, they call it voodoo, but it's really the element of witchcraft that comes in. So when Nigerian women are brought into Europe by traffickers for sexual exploitation, they are taken to a shrine where they are forced to make a vow before the gods that if they ever expose the identity or reveal the identity of the person bringing them into Europe, that they would die, that they would go crazy, that their family members would lose lives. And so blood is taken from them. They have some hair taken out of their armpits, their vaginal area. And so they really are forced to make this vow. So when they get here, regardless of what the police offers or what NGOs offer, they're always terrified to speak up because they have taken a vow, and the witch doctor has these personal belongings of theirs, their hair, their clothes, their underwear, and so they refuse to expose the trafficker because they feel that if they do, then the curse will befall them. And I worked with Doctors Without Borders on 2 rescue vessels, which you see on the next slide. And so it was interesting to be able to see the women as they were being rescued, right as they came out of Libya. That kind of a different perspective to my research as well. And so the routes that they come through, as you can see, they go from the south of Nigeria, from Edo State, which is the hub where 80 to 85, an estimated 80 to 85% of Nigerian women who are trafficked in come from. and they go up to Kano in the north, they go into the Niger Republic, and they go up to Libya, and then eventually in the aims of getting on the Mediterranean to cross over into Italy. I had 31 participants for my research, Campania, Piemonte, and Sicily in Italy. The recruitment locations were asked through an organization called PM Onlus that cares for victims of trafficking, and Terre de Monale. The second group is from the Napoli area, and these were girls that I had met when I worked with Doctors Without Borders and had stayed in touch with, and then later reached out to and said, would you be interested in being part of my research? And then the last group in Catania that I met through an organization called Penelope. So we have 3 measurement moments because, as I mentioned, our research is longitudinal. So we interview the women over women in my data, but for the overall project, it's all our participants, male and female. And we interview them over a course of a period of 2 years with a minimum of 6 months in between. So I did my first measurement moment in 2018, and then I started M2 later on in 2018 and continued on into last year. And then in February of this year, I started with measurement moment 3. So following up with the same people and finding out what has changed over the last time we spoke. As an M2, I had 22 participants. Now I have done 7 interviews, but it's ongoing with the COVID-19 restrictions. I haven't been able to continue, but once restrictions are lifted, then I go back on the streets. I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure I don't go beyond what I should. So in the meantime, these are some of the things that I've observed in my data. These are just some of my preliminary observed psychosocial impacts and patterns. Is the emotional, physical, and the spiritual exhaustion that they have. So for the ones for them, because they took the vow, they took an oath, they say they can't sleep, they have nightmares all the time about the oath that they took, or that somebody's chasing them, or that somebody's asking them to come and pay the trafficker, and this is having a big effect on their well-being. The constant unexplained fear. So for our research, it's a mixed methods approach. So we have questionnaires that have been ratified for use with vulnerable populations, and so we're using the questionnaires, and then we have the qualitative data aspect as well, data collection aspect. And so in some of the questions about whether they have nightmares or unexplained fears, like being afraid for no reason, this was something that was really high in my participants. Another issue that came up was the complicity and the involvement of family members or parents in their exploitation, in their trafficking, and how that's causing them not to trust anyone, basically. Isolation, because they're betrayed by friends and family members, and so they don't trust anyone, and so they isolate themselves, which then makes them more lonely, and the cycle just continues to repeat itself. Overly sexualized behaviors. I saw this in one of the shelters where everything was sexualized. Every joke, every conversation, everything had to be sexualized, and you can easily tie that to the experiences that they've had along the way. So I'm just going to go to some of the quotes that the girls shared. When they talk about the connection man in this quote, the connection man is the smuggler. And so she said, when the smuggler came to bail the people that have been arrested, he saw me and he said, I thought you were in Italy. I said, no, I've been here for a month. They arrested our boat. And the man said sorry. And that was when I cried and pleaded with him not to leave me. And he said he would bail me, but I will have to agree to be his girlfriend. I said, okay, no problem. Please just bail me. And this came up a few times as well, where girls were forced to date smugglers because they felt like they had no other choice. It was either date the smuggler or stay in prison. Does that mean I've used all my time?
No, I did I think it was feedback.
Oh no, just checking.
Sorry.
And so this was one of the things that came up in the data as well. And it's interesting to look at when you're thinking about choice and what choices do they make and how would they be treated in Europe if they were dating a smuggler, and would they be prosecuted, would they not? So these were just things that we were seeing in our data. On the next slide, this was something that came up more in my measurement moment 3. People contacting me and saying, I've been given my visa, I now have a 5-year document, I can stay in Italy, thank you so much for the research and for being in touch. Or people saying things like, my boss is taking advantage of me, and the labor exploitation aspect is what is now coming up in Italy, in my M3. of girls who are saying, now I have been granted asylum, now I can get a job, but the Italians are refusing to pay me the same wages as they would pay people of Italian nationality. And so this is just another upcoming issue. So the patterns so far, I just put a few of the patterns I've seen. In my M1 and M2, there were quite a number of pregnancies. I feel like every time I go back, more girls are pregnant or have just given birth. Yeah, lots of babies in between in the shelter, and you wonder, yeah, the babies may be a source of comfort, but we didn't really go into this. We didn't address this in the research. This wasn't one of our questions. It was just something that we saw, and we still see why a lot of them are getting pregnant and having babies. And there are speculations about that. Desperation for papers, permission to work, that was something that came out through all the interviews. They just wanted to work. And then in my M3, one of the bigger issues is difficulty in finding job, labor exploitation. But in all of my data, the loneliness, the stigma, the worry about the future, about taking care of families. And when I talk about stigma, I'm not just talking about stigma from Italians or from NGO staff. I'm talking about even stigma within the group itself, where if you have a girl who has a child as a result of rape, then the other girls discriminate against her because she doesn't know who the father of the child is, and it was the child is as a result of rape. And then stigma from the locals, who they say when they're coming through, they cover their nose and things like that. Okay, I'm almost done. Yay. And so some of the things that we're working on at the minute is, for example, in 2018, the Oba of Benin, the King of Benin, Benin City in Nigeria, which is where a lot of the women come from. In March of 2018, he made a public declaration, because he's both a ceremonial and a spiritual head. And he made a declaration saying that nobody is allowed to traffic any woman from Benin anymore. And he invoked the power of the gods and said, if you are trafficking Benin girls, this and this and this will happen to you. He basically put a curse on the traffickers and broke the curse on the women. And this was not something I went into my data looking for, but it came out that quite a number of girls in the data said, yeah, we left the trafficker because the Oba of Benin made this declaration and we knew we were free. And so we're looking at writing an article. We are working on an article about this, my data. Also, the involvement of family members in trafficking, complicit in their complicity in exploitation and trafficking, stigma and labeling, betrayal and distrust. And then there's, of course, the ethnographic piece about my experience as a Nigerian researcher conducting research among Nigerian women in Italy. But I also worked on a project in Brussels looking at West African women in prostitution there as well. So far we have this publications. I don't think you really need to go into this. I just put it up and it'll be in the slides. But the next steps for me right now is just, of course, continuing with my work, my publication and dissertation, and of course, my defense, hopefully next year. Next year. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. I really, really tried to do what I could, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Like, more. So interesting. So yeah, we'll come back for questions with you, but if we can invite Magdalena to present her research.
Okay, it's on. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So, few words of introduction. This is a new project. Totally this is their very first draft, and the first chance I have to present it, to confront it with wider audience. This is it is planned to be a kind of postdoc project, because I've already finished my PhD studies and defended my thesis about student protests in the Balkan countries. So this is a kind of bit shift into different parts of Europe. This idea came to me some time ago. Actually, I've been always fascinated with hunger strikes since I was writing dissertation about protests. But this project became possible, I guess, the very moment I visited Ukraine, and so there are some various similarities if it comes to history, structural aspects, and so on and so on, if it comes to Northern Ireland and Ukraine. And then, digging even more, I have discovered more of such similarities with Kazakhstan. So, I mean, this is the first time I'm just, presenting what was done at this stage until that time, and definitely, searching for some of, advices, confrontation and stuff like that. So the major research objective would be here, obviously, to investigate the political impact of famines and hunger for the modern and postmodern European project. So in general, I'm very, very, very much concerned and concentrated on researching not only hunger strikes, but definitely the kind of European dimension of hunger, of meaning of hunger for the European culture and politics. What is important for me is to show that there's a broad context which refers to different political aspects of emerging new nation states and new countries in Europe in modernity after the World War II, and it is all connected with processes of political separation, and in the meantime also those kind of plots of food deprivation and stuff like that, and other things together within the time and history, they kind of allow to create to emerge a kind of I would say culture of using hunger in politics, a political culture of hunger, something of that kind. And what would be the major idea would be to compare those hunger cultures in Northern Ireland, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Obviously, to be more precise, this kind of culture will be concentrated or will be focused on some I would say parts of the most important elements of nation states, so kind of things like borders, like sovereignty, like nationality, like citizenship and stuff like that. So how much all those aspects and intertwine, how they do interact with each other and stuff like that. I guess I was wondering, I was searching, trying to answer the question what the hunger does in the modern and postmodern Europe, and what is so important, since the postmodern theories of famine, they said the famine is not anymore considered as a natural disaster, because traditionally famines were considered as such. So they were observed, they were appearing in those regions of the world when there was no food for kind of reasons as droughts, as this kind of things. But this thinking was changing, and along that, new theories, new conceptual frames appeared. Those frames were saying that, well, we're not in modern and postmodern world, and not anymore the hunger is a kind of natural disaster. It's always mediated by kind of human action, human decision, human responsibility, and stuff like that. So I would like to use this kind of new famine thinking to give the major frame of for this project for understanding hunger in this European context. And obviously cultural conflict will be another part of the theoretical, of the practical, and also the frame of analysis for the project, because, well, along with emerging those new nation status countries, kind of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Northern Ireland, there's a lot of things around the cultural conflicts in Europe being is going on. So I do still profoundly here would be stuck to the concept of kind of European politics, and still would be very much trying to immerse in that European postmodern thinking about what's going on and stuff like that, because Europe is that part of the world when definitely there should be, in my opinion, there should be no hunger. There should be this kind of basic existential problems in 21st century Europe should be already solved. And what's the question, why still hunger is such an issue here? And so, from one hand, socially important, from the other hand, has that very strong political background, obviously connected to cultural conflicts and so on. Well, some of those events just resemble kind of economical problems with sharing and stuff like that. But mostly, I would assume that all of the conflicts have definitely just not just economic background, but definitely cultural one, because Europe itself is very much culturally, dynamic, conflicted, internally conflicted, and would be nice to just kind of try to show this internal divisions and present it in a, excuse me, more like in that way. Going further, what would be? I mean, I don't want to go very much inside deciding. Talking about this cultural conflicts. What are the potential solutions? What are the potential I don't know, problems, ways of mediation and stuff like that? Because that's what has been done. A lot of publication research being done about what's going on in Ukraine, in the Donbas region, in the Crimea region. What's going on? What's the problem with the Northern Ireland border and stuff like that? That's a very burning issue now, since we have also the problem of Brexit and stuff like that. This all been done. This is done, and it's not something I would like to continue or even work on. But I would like to concentrate very much on the kind of European general aspect. And those cases are not kind of minor things. They are very much specific characteristic and important for the European identity, for the European project in general. And I have few ideas how to approach those hunger strike and talk about how much they are important for the national legitimacy in politics, how much the experience of hunger and famine has brought the kind of way of legitimizing different movements of freedom, different social movements, different political action, hunger strikes including and stuff like that. So movement of separation and many other things. And that is just, as I said, just broad first glimpse of what, in my opinion, would be very much important to say, because I have that impression that in the contemporary Europe literature, cultural literature, those events, those conflicts, they are kind of considered as something that is the very borderlands of Europe. And I do really believe that it should be shown as a kind of general European problem about that is a kind of result of industrial development, of kind of modern thinking about politics, modern thinking about life, modern kinds of thinking about what human beings are, what are the needs and stuff like that. And how, on the other hand, all those hunger strikes and this experience of hunger has emerged and gave that culture of using hunger, and how much it is important, and how many times it showed to be actually a very useful and successful way of kind of overcoming a political stalemate. And this was not only shown in Northern Ireland, but the previous year was the situation, what was going on around the hunger strike of Oleg Sentsov, the screenwriter, the Ukrainian screenwriter, and how much his situation was, from one hand, similar. And the other thing that was also similar was the entire social context, the entire attempt to give the situation a very important political status. This, as far as you probably know, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Peace, and this kind of I would say not only prestigious awards for his behavior, but actually giving special social status to what he was doing. Probably because from one hand to save his life, from the other to change a little bit this kind of political disproportion, which was very much visible if it comes to prisoners of war in Ukraine prisons. I mean, actually Russian prisons. There were Ukrainian prisons and Russian prisons, and the kind of this overwhelming Russian attempt to dominate in Ukrainian politics. Also, kind of other minor stuff, the entire discourse of whether those prisoners who are still somewhere in the Russian prisons, Ukrainian prisoners in Russian prisons, or prisoners in British prisons and stuff like that. Who actually are those people? It was the discourse of volunteering versus terrorism. which is very, very, I would say, very interesting, because it's also kind of historical, cultural, discursive struggle. Who are those people, and what are the obligations and stuff like that. Well, and then finally, methodology. I'm going to use comparative politics. That's also a kind of first idea. I would like to, use. I'm gonna start with analyzing kind of basic, Ukrainian, Irish, and Kazakhstanian institution, kind of nation state, kind of borders, kind of sovereignty. Obviously, a lot of thinkers, kind of Michel Foucault, and a lot of similar to them, say when the border is not safe, is being challenged all the time. The country has a severe problem with sovereignty. So if as you probably know, both of the countries have problem with borders. So yeah, Crimea and Donbas conflict in Ukraine, especially, there is this question very much visible. So all those things together is like kind of, as I said, this is just a first result of a brainstorming, but something in that frame to show how much the hunger has ingrowth into that kind of European politics and borderlands of European politics. And from one hand is a kind of awkward element, from the other it's still very important, even though we should be getting rid of problems with hunger, because we know, obviously, we're in Europe, which has a good, social networks of food providing, a lot of, institutions providing different kind of security and stuff like that. So I guess that would be the major frames of the problem I would like to confront, and probably challenge in the future, in the form of any kind of project or something like that. Well, thank you.
We have some time for questions. If anyone has any, feel free to raise your hand or pop it in the chat box. Yeah, Ilse, go ahead.
Hey, thanks a lot for these three very interesting presentations. It's a kind of a more an overall reflection for the three presentations, but probably most for the one of Gillian and the last presentation also on in particular on the one of Gillian. I think it's interesting to see what's the legal framework. At the same time, it asks question how the legal framework is translated into practice and what that means. And then, of course, it connects to Sarah's presentation. So I'm often wondering how the legal framework on asylum, and in particular Geneva Convention, how that relates to experiences, events, things that happen that do not exactly fall under the Geneva Convention. So what kind of recognition can you have? Is it better to have a recognition in kind of political violence that is done to you? And then I'm referring to the work of Didier Fassin on the humanitarian discourse in asylum, and how that sometimes the political is just cut off in the entire process of humanitarian appeals and medicalized or granting asylum or status on basis of medical reasons, for example. So how is it good to kind of give that political status of recognized refugee to a victim of trafficking? And how does that relate? And then it connects, of course, to the two other presentations on the experiences of the people themselves. Sarah was referring to the difference between trafficking and smuggling, and we know legally that's often a big struggle. But to what extent, for example, also the experiences with the voodoo and the oath, is that something that can be taken in a kind of legal recognition, be it under trafficking, a specific procedure for victims of trafficking, be it under asylum? So how should we relate those different perspectives and frameworks of the legal framework and the migration management framework with people's experiences themselves, and then the political versus the other experiences like trafficking is not kind of political violence, you could say, but how do they both relate to each other?
Do you want me to go ahead and answer that? Yeah. So really, I think really interesting question. And I think So part of my research also looks at, you know, the limits of the refugee status, which I think is probably also what you're hinting at here in terms of what about lived experiences of people that don't fall neatly into those categories of protection. And I think that is a limit. So I think also looking at refugee law in the context of the fact that it is an exception to state sovereignty, like states are normally sovereign over, obviously, as you know, who can enter and exit. I think the refugee status, like, well, yes, maybe it's a political status, but it's first and foremost a legal status. And it's a legally defined status. So it's at a point in time, lawmakers came together, treaty negotiators came together and set limits. The problem is on the boundaries of those limits. And I think I think the refugee status has shown itself to be quite resilient. So, you know, the notion of persecution has evolved to cover sort of extreme human rights abuses. But I think, you know, there are situations that just don't fall within it. And then where are those people left? And I think when we look at the connection between asylum seekers and trafficking, those people are left in a very vulnerable situation. And that is a problem. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Alexander Betts, but he talks about survival migrants, especially in the African. I know this is obviously about Europe, but he talks about in the African situation survival migrants. So these migrants that don't fall neatly within these categories and then remain at risk because how are they going to be protected? And I think you know, different countries do different things. So in the EU regime, they've created this additional status of subsidiary protection, as I'm sure you're aware of, for people who don't quite fit that. But then the protections are less, but then there's still people who don't fall within any of those. And as you say, the trafficking, smuggling thing. So I think that's something that doesn't have any easy answers. I think we need to acknowledge the limits of the legal frameworks, but at the same time, I think the refugee status, the value in it is that it exists and that it's creating an obligation on states, that it removes that discretion from the state, that if someone fits those circumstances, they have to be protected. That's where I see the value of it. But for the people in the margins whose circumstances, and if you think about contemporary forms of displacement, even climate change, or at times people were talking about pandemic, which I think, you know, we couldn't have imagined until recently, but these are contemporary forms of displacement that don't lend themselves easily to protection. And I think the link between that and trafficking risk is something needs to be explored. So yeah, very, very relevant. No easy answers, I don't think. So thanks.
Ilse, do you want to come back on that at all? Are you happy with that? Yeah, that's great. Gillian, there's another question there in the chat box from Elaine for you. Have you considered the impact of the 2001, she thinks, EU Facilitation Directive on criminalising NGOs working with refugees and migrants? And maybe that's more related to smuggling. But that question as well, one thing that I kept kind of coming back to in your presentation myself was that, like, how crime seems to be being used as a way to get around the legalities of, like, the protected status of refugees, and how criminalising people on the fringes or it seems to be a way of getting out of legal obligations. So maybe do you have any thoughts on either of those things?
So that directive isn't something that I look at specifically in my research, but I think a wider sort of discussion on criminalising NGOs who are working with refugees and migrants. I think, you know, probably it's been in the media a lot recently in terms of search and rescue operations, and I'm sure Sarah and Ilse probably will have more to say on that. So I think that is an ongoing discussion. And yes, I think it's interesting, like that sort of transnational organised crime context that trafficking framework was agreed in. You know, is it ideal? Possibly not, but there are other authors in the field who would say that perhaps the way that trafficking has been criminalised and adopted, the framework adopted so widespread. I mean, the treaty was only negotiated and it concluded in the year 2000, and now almost every country in the world has adopted the definition. And if we know anything about the way that human rights treaties are ratified and implemented, it's much slower. So, you know, in some ways, perhaps it's been a benefit, but I think then the problems come whenever that transnational organised crime context, like with the border measures, etc., is used in a way that maybe could be relied on, especially in a time when maybe immigration controls are something that that states are looking towards more. So it is problematic, that framework, but then on the other side, maybe there are advantages to it as well. So I think it's about trying to tease out those problems and look for solutions, which is not always easy.
Definitely not. Thanks. That's really interesting. Anyone else have any other questions? I do. Bless you. I think Magdalena just sneezed. Yeah, Magdalena, go ahead.
Okay, microphone. Actually, I have questions to the two presentations. One for Gillian about this. Still want to continue on that kind of legal frame. You said something that you're going to concentrate on the European context in particular, but is there any specific about the European context, or are there any other contexts? What defines that European frames, or differs it from other frames, or are there other frames possible, even in thinking or acting or stuff like that? What's that differentiation? What that says about the other contexts? And I have a question to start, if I can ask it right now, if you don't mind. So I'll just ask. I was really interested, still interested about. You said you've mentioned that there are families somewhere they're waiting, and there's a pressure on the women to send the money back home. So do the families know what these women are doing actually? Is it kind of locally there? Is it a kind of official way of, I don't know, supporting the families? Is that kind of not official but way legal, or accepted, or it's not accepted but necessary? What's going on? Because those women go often go through hell and stuff like that, sending the money back home. But I mean, this is not, at least in many countries in the world, not the most accepted way of earning money for women. Yeah. So what does that say? Where's this the situation? Do they know? Are they being cheated, or what's the explanation for that situation? Obviously, assuming that families should support the women in a way as much as they are able to do that. Obviously, yeah. But that's the second question.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. And I, just to add to that question for you, Sarah, I was just wondering how, given the current circumstances we're in with COVID-19, how have you heard anything from how that's affecting people? How is that? Can you just tell us a bit? Because I'm just really interested in terms of how things are and that way. So yeah, I'd just be interested to know. Gillian, do you want to answer that question first? Are you happy to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, really, the choice to focus a little bit more on the European framework and the international framework was really the focus of this seminar in particular, being European studies more than anything else. In my PhD, I compare the regional approaches in Africa and Europe. I think I actually wanted to get away from a kind of Eurocentric view on refugee and asylum issues, because if you even look at a lot of the leading case law that's used in the international sphere, it's from sort of leading common law jurisdictions. So you would sort of see a lot of Australia, America, UK, but actually the vast majority of the world's refugees and asylum seekers are located outside of Europe, in the global south. And so I actually compare so when you say are there other frameworks, the EU framework is very advanced. There's a lot, they've established an entire asylum system, as you're probably aware. In Africa it looks a little bit different, but there are regional responses. So there's a recently adopted Malabo protocol. It's not yet enforced because it doesn't have the necessary ratifications, but it is actually a sort of hybrid of international criminal law and transnational organised crime. So it's the first time that trafficking will be criminalised beyond the state, that people can be held legally responsible for in the same way that they would be able to for international criminal law. So that's a different approach. Now, when that will get the necessary ratifications and the potential effectiveness of that, who knows? But I think it is important, as you say, to look at other ways and not to sort of say, oh, the way Europe's doing it is the way forward. I think there's a lot that isn't working in the common European asylum system. So yeah, I think it's absolutely of value to look beyond Europe, and it's something that I'm actively doing. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, so I'm just going to chip in and be like, as someone that does critique heavily the European approach to asylum and refugee policy, definitely interested in people that are looking beyond Europe, because I think sometimes the EU likes to hold itself up as a beacon of like, look, well, we're doing better than everyone else, and there's so many problems. Yeah, so I definitely commend that focus and the desire to shift away for sure. Sarah, to you, yeah.
Right. Yes. Thank you for the questions. First about the family. So that's actually the article I'm working on at the moment. In fact, I just finished a meeting with Ilse before we came here about the same article and what we're seeing. Okay, so maybe I should give a little bit of a background. So Benin in Nigeria, Benin City, Benin is the capital of Edo State. The women from Benin started coming into Europe as traders in the 70s. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Jürgen Carling, and he talks about that. He was one of the first academics who talked about this issue of Benin traders coming into Europe as women who were selling clothing. Some came as missionaries, and then they discovered that with prostitution, you could make so much money. And so then they started bringing other women from Nigeria in, and then started charging to bring them. And then it just went on and on into enslavement. And that was how the trafficking networks from Nigeria into Europe began. And now, if you go to Benin today, there are estates in Benin, and everybody knows that the money from those estates have come from women who were trafficked into Europe, or women who work in prostitution in Europe. And it's an open secret. Everybody knows, and people are aware. And the Nigerian society does not accept prostitution, but at the same time, it's acceptable that you can take care of your parents in Benin with money that you make from prostitution. So it's really a weird contradiction. And so in my data, I have participants, and what we're looking at now is, what do we even mean by complicity? Because there are people whose parents know that it's prostitution, but they don't realize that it's going to be sexual slavery. And so they think, oh, you go to Europe, you work in prostitution, you choose your own clients, you have sex with these rich white men, you make money, and that's it. And then there are those whose parents are like, look, even if you suffer, you know, that's what you have to do as a woman. You just need to hustle, make the money, and take care of us. And then there are those whose family members have no idea whatsoever. And so now I'm looking at my data and like separating these different groups. And if you, I mean, in Lagos, a lot of people in Lagos where I'm from and in other parts of Nigeria sometimes are like, yeah, we don't feel sorry for them because they knew, but it's really has different layers, because there are people who know, there are people who don't know, and still I can say the parents are aware, but are they really aware of what their children go through in the desert, that they are raped in the desert, that they drink their own urine in the desert, you know, that they're raped in Libya, and then that when they're in Italy, they have to have sex with men for 15 euros or 10 euros sometimes. And pay back a trafficker about 40,000 euros. And so I didn't interview the parents for this, and I'm thinking, okay, if I do a postdoc, it might be interesting to go and now focus on the parents. But right now, this is just from the perspective of the girls and in Benin, and the expectation of a lot of these parents really is that their children will take care of them. It's a big part of the Nigerian society, the African society. I think in parts of Asia, it's the same, similar to the Chinese filial piety concept of honoring your parents and bringing honor and not shame to them and taking care of them. And it's very similar in our society. And so these girls would do whatever it takes to care for their parents. And then the second question about COVID-19, and if there's something missing in the question, then please let me know. But yeah, I've been in touch with my participants, and it's been really bad, both with the ones in Brussels who technically are not supposed to be working in prostitution, but even when COVID-19, when we had the lockdown, they were still working. They found ways to do it, even though the red light district was closed. What we've heard is that they are still having clients because they have no other way to survive. They have no other way to make money. And with the girls in Italy, now that the restrictions have been lifted, the economy in Italy has been struggling anyway. It hasn't been the strongest of economies so far. And now it's just worse because Italians are out of job, and so are the girls. Some of them are undocumented still. Others have temporary asylum, temporary permit to stay. Others have been granted asylum. And so what they've all been saying is, like, we need a job, we don't have a job. And then it's coming back to, I think I need to go back on the streets, or I think I need to go back to my madame, or I think I need to go back to some friends of mine to hustle. But it's a really, really tough time. So as soon as on June 15, our borders will be completely open. Right now it's partly open, but it'll be fully opened. And then as soon as I find out what the university is allowing us to do or not do, my goal is to go back to Italy and continue with this.
Yeah, it's a very sad and horrifying situation, but yeah, your work is so important. Any questions for Magdalena before we finish? I'm conscious we've run over in time, so if you do have to rush on, that's okay. But it's just been a really interesting topic. But anyone have any questions for Magdalena before we go? No. I just to give you some comments, because I know it's just a thought, kind of, you're still developing the project. So I think it's really interesting. I think the comparisons. I mean, Northern Ireland, being from Northern Ireland, and Gillian, and you can probably tell by her accent is too. The hunger striker discourse has its own kind of like life, and I would be really interested. The comparisons to Ukraine and Kazakhstan are not ones that I would have thought of. So I think that's a really interesting approach. I'm currently working on. It's not even related to conflict or anything, but I'm looking at legal subjecthood and the matter of agency. How does the law and how does legal discourse think of agency? Things I was reading about this week actually was on hunger strikers and suicides in Guantanamo Bay, and how the narrative of how the hunger strike and the act of taking one's own life was used in to deny agency to different actors involved. And I think that's interesting as well in terms of looking at these tactics of hunger as a political tool. And so I thought that was interesting. And I'd be interested to know, just how does that feed into politics and wider politics. So yeah, I think it is
that's the major point. What's particular what way, because as I mentioned, for me, I think the question of Northern Ireland is very good. I mean, it's known. There's a lot of books, there's a lot of papers, there's a lot of sciences, there's a lot of things, but it's still kind of parochial things. It seems to be a parochial issue, while I think it's anything but a parochial issue. So I want to just kind of totally change the context and show it's a broad European problem, which is just kind of showed a bit to the borderlands. Actually, it's a European border and a Ukrainian border. It's a European border with Russia, so they're politically very important because they decide about sovereignty. But as I said, just kind of so the first draft. Thank you for this comment. I will try to look out for this hunger strikes, which we have mentioned. That would be very interesting to read it.
So thank you very much for taking your time and presenting your research. Just to remind you that your UACES does run a blog. If you wanted to maybe get some ideas out there into the webosphere, I can give you more information on that if that's something you're interested in. And we do have a drinks kind of networking event on the 8th of July, I think, which will be in the evening. If you there'll be more people at that one if you fancy just chatting to other people that are involved in UACES Graduate Forum. We were meant to be at our conference in Berlin, so we're just kind of on occasion with a few socially distanced virtual drinks. And we'll also be doing some stuff over the coming months in lieu of the events that we can't have in person. So keep an eye out for those if they're of interest to you or anyone else that you know that might be interested in stuff. But it was lovely to see you. I hope we get to see each other in person at some point. And yeah, have a really good rest of the day and rest of the week. And thank you for coming.